the crimson mark of Kali. Michael Morgan wiped the sweat from his brow as their jeep rumbled down the narrow dirt path. The dense jungle canopy filtered the afternoon sun into dappled patterns that shifted across the dashboard. The air hung thick with moisture, carrying the heady scent of jasmine mixed with something metallic that reminded him vaguely of copper. Beside him, Dani Sharma tapped excitedly on his phone, cursing under his breath as the signal bars flickered and finally disappeared. "Looks like we're officially off the grid," Dani announced, stuffing his phone into his pocket. "Just like old times, eh, Mike? Remember when we used to sneak into that abandoned warehouse after our shifts?" Michael smiled, though his eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. "That was 15 years ago, before I became a boring software engineer and you decided to start carrying a gun for a living." "Security consultant," Dani corrected with a grin. "And this trip is exactly what we both need. 2 weeks exploring real Hindu temples instead of reading about them in your books. My grandmother would be proud we're connecting with our heritage." Michael didn't mention that his interest in Hindu mythology was purely academic. The intricate systems of deities, particularly Kali, with her complex symbolism of destruction and rebirth, had fascinated him since university. His obsession had begun with a single manuscript he'd found in the university library, an obscure text on Kali's role as the destroyer of illusion. Something about those ancient pages had called to him, and he'd been unable to look away since. When Dani suggested this trip to a remote village known for its ancient temples, Michael couldn't resist. The village wasn't in any guidebooks. Dani had heard about it from his grandmother, who spoke of it in hushed tones as a place where the old ways never died. As they rounded a bend, the village appeared before them, a cluster of earthen structures beneath the sprawling arms of massive banyan trees. What immediately caught Michael's attention were the strange symbols carved into the tree trunks lining the path. Concentric circles with small marks radiating outward like crimson sunbursts. "What are those markings?" Michael asked, slowing the jeep. Dani leaned forward, squinting. "No idea, but they're fresh. Still wet." Michael reached out the window and touched one of the markings. The substance came away on his fingers, warm and sticky. He jerked his hand back inside, wiping it quickly on a tissue. Blood. It had to be blood. "Probably just some local ritual thing," Dani said with forced nonchalance. "You're the expert on all that mystical stuff." As they entered the village square, Michael felt a wave of unease wash over him. Though it was mid-afternoon, the village appeared deserted. Laundry hung motionless on lines, cooking fires smoldered unattended, and the only movement came from a skinny dog trotting hurriedly across their path. Yet Michael couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. From shadowed doorways, from between leaves, from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The jeep shuddered and died without warning. "Perfect timing," Dani said, hopping out. "We've arrived." Michael tried the ignition again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. He popped the hood and found nothing obviously wrong, no disconnected wires, no leaking fluids, yet somehow knew the vehicle wouldn't start again. For a brief moment, he thought he saw one of the crimson symbols etched into the engine block, but when he blinked, it was gone. "Dani, check your phone," he called out. Dani pulled out his phone and frowned. Dead. Battery was at 70% just a minute ago. He shook it, as if that might help. "Yours?" Michael checked his own phone. Not only was it dead, but the screen displayed a spiderweb of cracks that hadn't been there during their journey. At the center of the fracture pattern was a perfect circle. A chill ran down Michael's spine despite the oppressive heat. Something felt wrong here, but his rational mind dismissed the thought. Car trouble was common in remote areas, and cell service was unreliable at best. They'd planned for this. "Let's find whoever's in charge and get settled," Michael said, grabbing his backpack from the jeep. "We can deal with the car later." As they walked through the village, Michael noticed more of the strange crimson markings, not just on trees, but etched into door frames and painted onto stone walls. Some appeared to shift slightly in his peripheral vision, though when he looked directly at them, they remained static. Once, he could have sworn he saw one of the symbols pulsing like a heartbeat, but when he stepped closer to examine it, the movement ceased. The distant thrum of drums reached their ears, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to match Michael's heartbeat, accelerating slightly as they ventured deeper into the village. The drumming never grew louder or softer, maintaining a constant presence that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They found no one to greet them until they reached the village center, where an elderly man sat cross-legged beneath a stone statue of Kali. The statue was ancient, weathered by countless monsoons, yet the crimson paint adorning its multiple arms looked freshly applied. The goddess had been depicted in her most fearsome aspect, tongue extended, a garland of skulls around her neck, standing atop the prone form of Lord Shiva. In one hand, she held a severed head, in another, a sword. The remaining hands displayed mudras Michael recognized from his studies, one offering blessings, another promising fearlessness. The old man didn't speak or acknowledge their presence until they stood directly before him. When he finally looked up, Michael noticed his eyes, milky white with cataracts, yet somehow focusing precisely on them. "You have come," he said in heavily accented English, his voice carrying an unnatural resonance. "The rooms are prepared." "We're looking for accommodations," Michael began. "We'd be happy to pay." "Payment has been made," the old man interrupted. For an instant, Michael thought he saw something move beneath the man's skin, like fingers pressing outward from inside his cheek. But it was gone so quickly, he dismissed it as a trick of the light. Before Michael could ask questions, the man stood with surprising agility and gestured for them to follow. He led them to a small structure at the village edge, a simple two-room dwelling with basic furnishings and no electricity. The walls were adorned with intricate paintings depicting Kali in various forms, dancing in cremation grounds, battling demons, receiving offerings from devotees whose faces were contorted in expressions between ecstasy and agony. "Rest. Night comes quickly in the jungle," the old man said before departing without another word. "Friendly bunch," Dani remarked, tossing his bag onto one of the beds. "I'm going to explore before it gets dark." "Coming?" Michael shook his head. "I'll stay here and organize our supplies. Don't go far. We don't know the area." After Dani left, Michael unpacked methodically, laying out their equipment with the precision that had made him successful in software engineering. As he worked, he noticed a small detail that disturbed him. The bed linens were embroidered with the same concentric circle pattern they'd seen on the trees. He ran his fingers over the stitching, surprised to find it slightly damp to the touch, though there was no visible moisture. When finished unpacking, he stepped outside, drawn by the persistent drumming that never ceased. The heat had become even more stifling, the air so thick it felt like breathing through wet cloth. Michael's shirt clung to his back, soaked with sweat that smelled faintly metallic. The jungle had darkened considerably, though sunset was still an hour away. Michael followed a narrow path behind their dwelling, intending to circle back to the village center. As he walked, he noticed the undergrowth seemed to shift subtly around him, branches bending slightly away as he approached, then curling inward behind him. He paused, watching a vine slowly retract when he focused on it, then resume its movement when he pretended not to look. "Just heat exhaustion," he muttered to himself, "making me see things." That's when he saw her. She stood in a small clearing, wearing a red sari that caught what little light filtered through the canopy. Her long black hair fell in waves past her waist, adorned with small white jasmine flowers that seemed too fresh, too perfect in this withering heat. When she turned to face him, Michael felt his breath catch. Her eyes were depthless pools of obsidian, and her smile held both invitation and warning. Most striking was the small crimson bindi between her brows, a perfect circle that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. "You must be one of the visitors," she said in perfect, unaccented English. Her voice carried an undertone like distant chimes. "I'm Priya." "Michael," he replied, extending his hand. When their fingers touched, he felt a jolt like static electricity, followed by a momentary sensation of something crawling beneath his skin. "Sorry if I'm intruding." "Not at all," Priya said, her smile widening to reveal teeth that seemed just slightly too numerous, though when she spoke again, they appeared perfectly normal. "I've been waiting for you." "You have?" "For someone like you," she clarified, her gaze never wavering, never blinking. "Someone who understands." Michael found himself unable to look away from her eyes. They seemed to expand, filling his vision until he felt he might fall into them. Understands what? The old ways, Kaylee, destruction and rebirth. She gestured around them with a fluid grace that seemed almost choreographed. Few Westerners appreciate the deeper meanings, but you've studied the ancient texts, haven't you? The Kalika Purana, the Mahanirvana Tantra. As she spoke, Michael noticed something odd about her shadow. It appeared to shift independently, stretching and contracting against the jungle floor. For a moment, he thought he saw multiple arms extending from her silhouette, though when he blinked, her shadow matched her form perfectly. "I've studied Hindu theology for years," Michael said, forcing his attention back to her face. "The complexity of Kali's symbolism is fascinating, how she represents both destruction and maternal protection, the aspect of time as the ultimate devourer." Priya's smile remained fixed, though something flickered behind her eyes, approval perhaps or hunger. Most see only the surface, the blood, the skulls. They miss that Kali destroys only to create space for rebirth. She ends illusion. Her voice dropped to a whisper. She frees us from Maya. That's exactly what drew me to her mythology, Michael admitted, surprised by his own candor. The idea that destruction can be an act of compassion. "Perhaps you'd like to see our temple. It's not like the tourist attractions. This is where Kali truly lives." Michael should have declined. He should have returned to find Dani. Instead, he heard himself accept her invitation. As they walked deeper into the jungle, the drumming grew more insistent, though still no louder than before. Now it was joined by occasional whispers that seemed to emanate from the foliage itself, suzerations in Sanskrit that Michael could almost, but not quite, understand. They spoke of mythology and symbolism as they walked, and Michael found himself impressed by Priya's knowledge. She described obscure rituals and texts he'd only glimpsed references to in his studies. Her movements were graceful, almost hypnotic, as she led him along overgrown paths. Only once did he notice something truly disturbing. When she pushed aside a hanging vine, her arm seemed to bend at an impossible angle, the joint moving in a way human anatomy shouldn't allow. When she caught him staring, she smiled knowingly. "The body is merely a vessel," she said, as if that explained everything. A branch snapped nearby, and Michael turned sharply at the sound, suddenly remembering Dani. "My friend. He doesn't know where I've gone." "Time moves differently here," Priya replied cryptically. "What feels like hours may be mere moments." By the time they reached the temple, a stone structure mostly reclaimed by jungle, twilight had fallen completely. The temple's architecture was unlike any Michael had seen in his research. Older, more primal, with carvings that depicted Kali not as a deity, but as something that existed before gods, before time itself. The crimson markings formed intricate patterns around the doorway, and as Michael watched, they seemed to rearrange themselves slowly, like living things. "Only those who have been invited may enter," Priya said, her voice now carrying an echo though they stood in the open air. "You should return to your friend now. He needs you." The abrupt dismissal broke whatever spell had held Michael. "Dani? What do you mean?" But Priya had already melted into the darkness, leaving Michael alone before the temple. The sudden silence told him the drums had stopped, though he couldn't recall when. In their place came a high, thin buzzing, like insects, but somehow mechanical in its precision. Michael hurried back toward the village, his path illuminated by the rising moon. The jungle seemed different now, denser, more animate. Twice he had to backtrack when the path simply ended at solid walls of vegetation that hadn't been there before. Time stretched strangely. The moon barely moved across the sky despite what felt like hours of walking. When he finally reached their quarters, he found Dani lying on his bed, shivering despite the heat. The room smelled of jasmine and copper, so strong it made Michael's eyes water. "Mike," Dani groaned. "Something bit me." He pulled up his shirt to reveal an angry red mark on his abdomen, the same concentric circle pattern they'd seen carved into the trees. Michael examined the wound carefully. It wasn't a bite at all, but looked more like a brand, the skin raised and blistered in the precise pattern. As he watched, the mark seemed to pulse slightly, the edges spreading outward by millimeters. "We need to get you to a doctor," Michael said, his voice steadier than he felt. "There's no way out," Dani mumbled, his eyes unfocused. "I tried walking back to the main road. Jungle's too thick now. Wasn't like that before." He grabbed Michael's wrist suddenly, his grip painfully tight. "I saw things in the trees, Mike. Things watching me. And a woman in red. She smiled at me, but her face..." He trailed off, shuddering. Michael grabbed the first aid kit and cleaned the wound, though it didn't look like any injury he'd seen before. The skin around it felt hot to the touch, and when he pressed a cool cloth against it, the cloth came away stained with symbols that hadn't been there before. While Dani fell into a restless sleep, Michael sat by the single window, watching shadows move through the village. The locals had emerged after dark, moving in strange, synchronized patterns through the square. They didn't speak to one another, yet moved as one being, appearing in places they couldn't have reached so quickly, as if teleporting when not observed directly. Michael rubbed his eyes, certain he was hallucinating from exhaustion. When he looked at his hands, he noticed thin red lines tracing the creases of his palms, like the crimson markings but fainter, as if just beginning to form. That night, Michael dreamed of Dani tied to a stone altar, his chest carved with crimson patterns, while villagers chanted in unison. Above him stood Priya, no longer beautiful, but twisted and inhuman, her form shifting between woman and something with too many limbs. Her face remained serene as she peeled back Dani's skin to reveal not blood and bone, but intricate mandalas glowing from within. In the dream, Michael tried to scream, but found his own hands performing ritual gestures against his will, his body a puppet to another's commands. The most terrifying part was how right it felt. Each movement bringing clarity, each gesture connecting him to something vast and ancient that had always been waiting just beyond his perception. He woke drenched in sweat to find Dani's bed empty. The sheets were arranged in the same concentric circle pattern, stained with what could only be blood. Outside, the village remained eerily quiet despite the full daylight. The heat had intensified, creating a shimmering effect that made buildings appear to breathe, Michael called for Dani, but received no response except a distant echo that sounded more like laughter than his friend's name. Returning to their room, he noticed something he'd missed before, a small leather-bound journal tucked beneath his mattress. It wasn't his, and certainly not Dani's. The leather felt warm to the touch, as if recently held, and carried the same jasmine copper scent that permeated everything. The journal contained frantic entries from someone named Thomas Harrison, dated 3 months earlier. They detailed his arrival in the village with a research team, their growing unease, and the disappearance of his colleagues one by one. The handwriting deteriorated with each entry, becoming more erratic, interspersed with drawings of the concentric circle pattern and passages in Sanskrit that Michael recognized as invocations to Kali. "The dreams feel more real than waking," one entry read. "I see myself performing the rituals before they happen. My hands know movements I've never learned." The final entry was a hurried scrawl. "It's not Kali they worship, but something wearing her form. The crimson mark spreads inside me now. I feel it moving beneath my skin like a second pulse. They're coming for me now. They say I'm ready to become a temple." Michael closed the journal, his hands shaking. The rational part of his mind, the software engineer who believed in logic and causality, insisted there must be an explanation. Mass hysteria, hallucinogens in the water, something tangible and explainable. Yet another part of him, growing stronger by the hour, recognized a deeper truth, that he'd been drawn here by something that knew him better than he knew himself. That he'd been studying Kali not out of academic interest, but because something had been calling him all along. He searched the village, finding it as deserted as when they'd arrived. In one abandoned dwelling, he discovered a backpack with Canadian tags, too new to belong to Harrison. Inside were more journals, all describing similar experiences from different visitors over the past year. Some contained photographs showing smiling tourists who, as the pages progressed, appeared increasingly gaunt, their eyes developing the same unblinking quality Michael had noticed in Priya. In another home, he found a collection of passports from various countries, each displayed on a small altar surrounded by the crimson markings. When he reached for one, the crimson circle on the wall behind it seemed to dilate like a pupil, watching him. As the day progressed, Michael noticed small crimson marks appearing on his belongings, handprints too small to be his or Dani's, arranged in patterns like those on the trees. When he returned from washing in a nearby stream, he found a perfect circle drawn in what looked like fresh blood on his bed. More disturbing were the changes in his own body. The thin red lines on his palms had darkened, and similar marks had appeared on his wrists and forearms, tracing the paths of his veins. Occasionally, he felt something move beneath his skin, a shifting, crawling sensation that began at his fingertips and worked its way toward his heart. Twice, he caught his reflection performing actions he wasn't, once in a polished metal surface, once in a puddle of water. His reflection would smile when he frowned, or raise a hand when his remained at his side. Each time, the discrepancy lasted only a second before synchronizing with his actual movements. The drumming started again at sunset, joined now by voices chanting in overlapping rhythms. The sound formed patterns that seemed almost mathematical in their precision, building complex harmonies that resonated in Michael's chest cavity. Following the rhythm, Michael found himself drawn back to the temple where he'd left Priya. This time, the entrance stood open, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. Against every rational thought, Michael entered. The steps led deep underground, illuminated by oil lamps that cast more shadows than light. The walls were adorned with carvings older than any he'd studied, depictions of Kali not as a goddess, but as a principle, a force that existed before humanity had names for such concepts. In some carvings, she appeared almost insectile, with too many limbs and eyes. In others, she was pure abstract geometry, the concentric circles forming a pattern that hurt to look at directly. The drumming grew louder, joined now by chanting in a language that didn't sound like Sanskrit or any human tongue Michael recognized. It reminded him of the processing languages he worked with. Algorithmic, perfectly structured, yet utterly alien. He followed the sound to a vast chamber where his nightmare materialized before him. Dani lay spread eagle on a stone altar, crimson patterns painted across his bare chest. But what Michael had thought was paint in his dream was clearly something else entirely. The patterns moved beneath Dani's skin, pulsing with each labored breath, occasionally forming shapes that resembled hands pressing outward as if trying to emerge. Around him, villagers swayed in unison, their movements too coordinated to be natural. Michael noticed that many bore deformities, extra fingers, joints that bent backward, faces with features slightly out of proportion. Yet these abnormalities seemed less like mutations and more like transformations in progress. And there stood Priya, transformed. Gone was the beautiful woman from the jungle. In her place stood something that only approximated humanity. Limbs too long and jointed in wrong places, movements too fluid to obey physics. Her face remained hauntingly beautiful, but her shadow thrashed against the wall, displaying multiple arms and a twisted form that reminded Michael of the illustrations of Kali in his oldest texts. "You've come to witness," she said, her voice resonating from multiple points in the chamber simultaneously. Each syllable overlapped the previous one, creating an echo effect that made understanding difficult. "As all carriers must." "Let him go," Michael demanded, stepping forward. Two villagers blocked his path, their eyes unfocused and movements jerky, like puppets operated by an unskilled puppeteer. "Your friend called to us first," one of them said, though their lips didn't move. The mark recognized him as suitable. Priya laughed, the sound transforming into the buzzing Michael had heard in the jungle. "You misunderstand your purpose. You were never meant to save him." As she spoke, Dani's eyes flew open, but they weren't his eyes anymore. The pupils had expanded to fill the entire visible surface, becoming perfect concentric circles that matched the patterns on his chest. Something else looked out from behind them. Something ancient and hungry that recognized Michael as kin. Dani's body convulsed, the crimson markings growing more pronounced until they appeared to float above his skin. His chest cavity split open along the pattern lines, but instead of blood and organs, the opening revealed a space that shouldn't have been possible, a chamber much larger than Dani's body could contain, lined with the same carvings Michael had seen on the temple walls. "What are you doing to him?" Michael shouted, his voice breaking. "Kali requires vessels," Priya said, approaching the altar. Her movements were wrong, each step covering more distance than physically possible, her feet sometimes not touching the ground at all. "Some to serve as temples," she gestured to Dani's transformed body, "and some to serve as messengers." Her gaze fixed on Michael. "Your friend was simple, a perfect temple, nothing more. But you, Michael Morgan, you have been preparing yourself for years. Every text you read, every symbol you studied, every moment spent contemplating Kali. You've been carving the pathways inside yourself, making room for what comes next." Michael lunged toward Dani, breaking past the villagers. He reached the altar and grabbed his friend's arm, but Dani's skin felt wrong, too hot and somehow hollow beneath his fingers, as if the flesh were just a thin membrane over an empty space. Dani turned to look at him, his face contorting into a smile too wide for his features. "Mike," he whispered, though his lips didn't move with the words. "You brought us here. You found the way. Knowledge is invitation, and you've been inviting us in for years." Priya placed her hand on Michael's chest, her fingers elongating until they pressed against his skin like blades. Where they touched, Michael's flesh became transparent, revealing the pattern already forming beneath. Concentric circles surrounding his heart, pulsing with each terrified beat. "The mark is already within you," she said. "It has been since you first read of Kaylee, since you first allowed the symbols into your mind. Thought is form. Form is invitation." Pain exploded across Michael's chest as something burned beneath his skin. He stumbled backward, tearing open his shirt to find a crimson mark forming over his heart. The same concentric pattern from the trees, from Dani's wound, from everything in this cursed village. The villagers converged on Dani, their movements now frenzied. Michael caught glimpses of ritual cutting, of blood flowing in precise patterns, of his friend's body arching impossibly upward as something else moved beneath his skin. The chanting reached a crescendo, and for a moment, Michael saw the air above the altar shimmer and part, revealing a glimpse of something vast and many-limbed that existed in a space with geometries he couldn't comprehend. "Your turn comes later," Priya said, her voice now directly in Michael's mind. "First, you must carry the message. The mark knows where to go." An inhuman scream tore through the chamber, and Michael ran. Through the chamber, up the stone steps, into the jungle night. The path that had been impassable for Dani opened before him, branches bending away as if afraid to touch him. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to collapse, never looking back, certain that something followed just beyond the reach of his perception. By dawn, he had somehow reached the main road, where a passing truck took him to the nearest town with a hospital. The doctors found nothing physically wrong with him, besides dehydration and exhaustion. They attributed his story to hallucinations from a jungle fever, especially when no one could locate the village he described on any map. When Michael insisted on showing them the mark on his chest, they saw nothing but unbroken skin. "Perhaps you need psychological help," one doctor suggested gently. "Losing your friend this way. It's trauma, you understand." For Dani was indeed missing. Calls to his family, to authorities, to the embassy, all confirmed that Dani Sharma had disappeared somewhere in the southern jungle region. Search parties found no trace of their vehicle or their belongings. It was as if they had never been there at all. 3 weeks later, back in his apartment in Bangalore, Michael stood before his bathroom mirror, examining the crimson mark on his chest. It had neither faded nor become infected. Instead, it had grown more defined. The concentric circles now perfectly symmetrical, extending tendrils along his veins toward his shoulders and neck. As he watched, the mark pulsed once, twice, with its own heartbeat separate from his own. In the mirror, Michael caught a glimpse of something behind him, a shadow with too many arms. When he turned, nothing was there, but he knew with terrifying certainty that he was not alone in his body anymore. His phone rang, an international number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to a British researcher named Emma Clayton. "Mr. Morgan, my colleague gave me your contact. I understand you recently visited a village in the southern jungle region. I'm investigating similar locations and would very much like to meet. I've been studying some unusual Sanskrit texts about Kali's role as..." As she spoke, Michael felt his right hand begin to move of its own accord, fingers forming unfamiliar patterns in the air, mudras he had never learned but somehow knew perfectly. In the mirror, his shadow briefly displayed multiple arms, moving independently of his body. His tongue felt thick in his mouth, and when he spoke, the voice that emerged carried undertones of buzzing, of distant drums, of Priya's hypnotic cadence. Knowledge is form. Form is invitation. "Mr. Morgan, are you there?" Michael watched his reflection smile without his permission. The mark pulsed again, sending crimson tendrils beneath his skin, spreading outward from his chest toward his neck and shoulders. In the bathroom light, his skin had become almost translucent, revealing not veins and muscle, but intricate patterns that shifted and reformed with each heartbeat. "Yes," he heard himself say, though he was screaming silently inside. "I would be happy to show you the way. Knowledge spreads, after all, like a crimson mark." In the mirror, the concentric circles in his eyes expanded, pupils dilating into perfect geometric patterns. And somewhere deep in his mind, Michael understood the truth at last. Kaylee had never been the destroyer, or the mother, or the goddess. She had been the pattern itself, waiting to be invited in. And he had been inviting her all along. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little tale of academic curiosity gone horribly wrong. Remember, folks, the next time someone offers to show you an ancient temple off the beaten path, maybe just stick to the gift shop instead. If this story left a crimson mark on your psyche, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more content that'll have you checking your reflection for extra limbs. Don't forget to hit that notification bell, or Carly might just hit it for you.